Eugene Tan is an associate professor of law at Singapore Management University. Eugene, nice to catch up again.
Thank you for having me, Mike. It's always a pleasure.
Can you briefly give us a recap on the outcome of the general election and the breakup of seats in the new parliament?
The general election was held on 10th of July amid the COVID-19 pandemic. The ruling People's Action Party won 83 out of the 93 seats, with the leading opposition party, the Workers' Party, claiming the other 10. So in terms of vote share, the ruling People's Action Party saw a significant dip from 69.9 in the 2015 general election, going down this time to 61.2%. By many other democracy standards, this would be a landslide victory, but by the own PAP standards, a bit on the poor side. They were expecting something between 63 and 65%. In my view, this was probably the ruling party's worst performance, not in terms of vote share, because they polled 60% in 2011, but in terms of the percentage of seats that they were not able to win, this would be the highest. So the opposition now has almost 11% of the elected seats, still a long way to go, but it does suggest that the opposition, is making inroads incrementally.
Eugene, why was there a large swing against the People's Action Party?
Well, Mike, this is one where different parties and different commentators would have different views. For the ruling People's Action Party, based on a preliminary analysis that they had done of the results, they claim that it is because of the COVID-19 pandemic that it has affected people in the 40s to 50s age group. That the economic pain had hit them hard, particularly those who live in private properties. And that's only about 20% of the population. That they felt that the government didn't do enough. Other commentators, and myself included, I think the ruling People's Action Party suffered that swing not so much because of weak governance over the last 5 years. I think it had more to do with how they governed. I think there is a sense that the ruling party, despite having very effective policies, could govern with a lot more empathy, humility, and more of a servant type leadership. So I think there is a mixed bag of reasons. I think that the PAP also didn't campaign well. But I would think that the primary reason would be that over the last 6 months, Singaporeans have had the chance to see how the government responded to the COVID-19 pandemic. There were good points, but I think there were also not so good aspects of the response. And in a way, the response was not so much over the pandemic, but rather the pandemic exposed the soft underbelly of society, the vulnerable groups, the inequalities. I think these were laid bare during the last 6 months, particularly when Singapore had a lockdown, what we call a circuit breaker here. And I think all that in many ways, took some shine off the ruling party. And there was a sense that perhaps, with more opposition, and this time around with the opposition having a better campaign platform, but more importantly, having very credible candidates, and being better at also on the campaign trail, that they were able to persuade voters that they deserve a fair hearing, and in fact, deserve their votes.
Tell us about the new cabinet and what the reshuffle or limited extent of it signifies.
Well, this is the final lap of the leadership renewal and transition in Singapore. Prime Minister Lee Hsien Loong had indicated that he would like to hand over the premiership, to his successor by the time he turns 70, and that would be in February 2022. But with the pandemic crisis at hand, I think the Prime Minister's hand was somewhat forced, that he focused a lot more on continuity. So the idea that cabinet ministers should be able to hit the ground running, and that in the frontline ministries, such as those of health, trade and industry, as well as manpower, that it would be better not to change horses midstream, as it were. That it would be better to have the ministers, familiar with the issues and being able to continue with their efforts, to restore the economy to health. So I think this is very much a COVID-19 crisis cabinet, if I can put it that way. It is also very much a transitional cabinet in the sense that once the situation stabilizes, in terms of dealing with the public health dimension and the economy starts to show signs of recovery, that we will have another cabinet reshuffle. But it also appears that the Prime Minister would probably have to stay on beyond 70. But there shouldn't be an inordinate delay in terms of the handover, because that in itself would create some questions of confidence as to whether the next generation of leaders are ready to take over.
Not a good time to be ruling at the moment, is it, Eugene?
Oh, definitely, right? I think, it's a thankless job in the sense that even if it's done well, that people might ask whether more could have been done. And in an unprecedented crisis like COVID-19, which is not just a public health crisis, but also an economic emergency, so many things could go wrong. And people's expectations are high, that the government should be equal to the task. And so this really is a difficult time, as you pointed out, that it doesn't matter which country you're in, it's really tough, being in the hot seat, being in government, because so many things could go wrong. And the question is, it's always easier, it's always much more easier to analyze the sort of issues, what should have been done after the fact. So in many ways, I think that this is a very pertinent point that you raise. How the ruling party deals with this crisis over the next 5 years will, in many sense, determine the next election's outcome. Because I think if they do a reasonably good job, public confidence will be buoyed. But at the same time, if there's a sense that they could have done better, then I think it could affect the ruling party in very much the same way, that the last 6 months has affected the ruling People's Action Party here in Singapore.
Who are the people on the government side to watch, people which have the most difficult portfolio challenges?
I would say, first of all, the Prime Minister, right? This is his last leg, probably the final 2 to 3 years of his prime ministership, something that he assumed, an office that he assumed in 2004. So his challenge would be to stabilize the economy, ensure that the public health situation remains very well under control. Never mind that in many other countries, there have been new waves of infection, and certainly Singapore is concerned with that. But his bigger role, in some other sense, would be to ready the next generation of leaders. That's a monumental challenge, in the sense that unlike his generation, or unlike the Prime or Mr. Lee himself, who had 14 years of understudy as the Deputy Prime Minister, his successor, would probably have no more than about 10 years, and even then, not the whole entire 10 years, was as a Deputy Prime Minister. So that's one, key role that he has. In many ways, it will determine his legacy. The other person to watch would be the Deputy Prime Minister, Heng Swee Keat, who is seen as the Prime Minister in waiting. He didn't fare too well, in his own constituency. He was moved to a new constituency, and he polled about 54%. Previously, the People's Action Party polled 60%, and many have said that if he wasn't moved there, the ruling party would have probably lost that multi-member seat. So his task would be to demonstrate, that he is ready to take over from Prime Minister Lee, despite a very short runway in terms of preparation. He has only been Prime Minister since 2018. And his task is also to ensure that his team of lieutenants, the ministers and junior ministers, would also be able to inspire public trust and confidence, that this fourth generation of leaders, as they're so called in Singapore, would be equal to the task of taking Singapore to new heights.
You now have an official leader of the opposition. Was this a gesture from PM Lee, Prime Minister Lee, a surprise, or did he have maybe little choice given the number of seats the Workers' Party won?
Mike, the leader of the opposition office, is something which is very established in many Westminster parliamentary systems, like Australia and the UK, for example, is rather new, or rather, this is the first time that we're having this leader of the opposition office. And so certainly, as the Prime Minister mentioned, in the wee hours of 11th July, when he gave a press conference after all the results were released, that this office seeks to recognize, that there is a role for the opposition in Singapore's one-party dominant system. So it is an important office in the sense that it seeks to institutionalize, the role of the opposition as a loyal, credible, and responsible opposition in Singapore's system of government. But I think it also should be recognized, that this could be a tactical move in the sense that it seeks to put greater demands, on the opposition. So, for example, the Prime Minister indicated twice, including at a swearing-in ceremony earlier this week, that it is no longer enough for the opposition to ask difficult questions of the government, with regard to their policies and proposed laws, important as that function is of any opposition in any system, but that the opposition must now go beyond that to also propose alternative policies and have those policies scrutinized and debated in Parliament. So I think, there is a sense that people are using different yardsticks, to measure the ruling party and the opposition. But regardless of, what intentions there are, I think it is a timely move. It is an important development because it's only a question of the fullness of time, that Singapore would develop into a two-party or a multi-party democracy. And I think it is important to, for there to socialize, if I could put it that way, the opposition into the prospects, that they would one day be able to form the government in waiting, and if the situation arises, for them to take over, from the ruling party, which has governed Singapore since 1959.
Interesting watching this whole thing evolve, and it's just really fascinating, to say the least. Hey, Eugene, pleasure chatting with you. We must do this more often. We always say this, and you took up our offer. Thank you very much, and we'll have a chat again about other aspects. Maybe we'll focus entirely on the opposition, and you can give us your thoughts.
I'll be happy to, Mike. It's always a pleasure. Thank you for having me.